This is AM Agenda. With me now, the Shadow Immigration Minister, Richard Marles. Mr Marles, your thoughts on the Prime Minister's comments relating to remote communities and the reaction this morning from Mick Gooder and others?
Well, this is a complex issue, how you deal with remote communities, and it's been grappled with by governments of all persuasions at a state and a federal level. But one thing that doesn't help is to come up with a comment which seeks to deny people's identity and connection with their own home by describing people living where they come from as being a lifestyle choice. I mean, I don't see how that possibly can help shape this debate or move this very difficult conversation along when you are describing where people come from and their decision to stay at home as being a lifestyle choice. It obviously is fundamental to how we deal with these issues, how you do balance the provision of services with where people live and their sense of identity with that place. These comments don't help.
Okay, well then what's your reaction to suggestions that this is just common sense from the Prime Minister when he says things like, if you want to close the gap, you've got to get the kids to school, the adults to work, and you've got to ensure that communities are safe and in order to get kids to school and adults to work. He's saying that, essentially, if we want to meet these targets, that some of these choices or locations where people live, just it's not realistic to enable government to help them achieve that.
Well, of course you've got to get kids to school, and of course you've got to get adults to work. That's really important in closing the gap. But it's not common sense to start dictating where people's home is. We're talking about places, which as Mick Gooder said, that people have been living in for generations. It's where they come from. It is their place of connection. It's at the core of their identity. And so it's not common sense to be able to say that you can just rule a line through all of that and somehow on the basis of that come up with the solution which does answer the question around the provision of schools and the provision of employment. At the end of the day, people are entitled to live where they do, and at the end of the day, people's identity and their connection with their home is central to any outcome here, and actually I think it is the opposite of plain common sense to seek to deny that.
Let's look at the automotive industry now and the government backtracking on support for an industry which is pretty important in Victoria, but obviously South Australia as well. You'd welcome the additional funds through that transformation scheme. That was obviously something Labor was intending on doing.
Well, I was listening to the comments of the Assistant Minister before, Stuart Robert, where he indicated that the government was tracking well. I mean, heaven help us, Kieran. I mean, imagine what they would be like on a bad day if this is them tracking well. I mean, the only word that Stuart Roberts said which made any sense to me was when he used the word knee-jerk, which I actually think quite rightly describes the actions that we saw yesterday in the government's whatever they were trying to do in terms of reinstating funding to the automotive industry. It started off with 900 million at the beginning of the day. A few hours later, we were looking at 500 million. By the end of the day, the Treasurer had weighed in and said, well, actually, it's only going to be 100 million. This is less than a month into allegedly good government. Yesterday was an absolute shambles, and it treats auto workers with utter contempt. I mean, to have that kind of message play out during the day, actually I think is quite cruel in the context of all that has happened to auto workers over the last year or so. We all know, and I can tell you auto workers in Geelong know, that the only job yesterday's announcement was about was Tony Abbott's.
Wasn't it? But isn't it a government listening to say, well, okay, the automotive, the supply chain, that those suppliers might be in trouble, therefore jeopardise the timetable of the automotive manufacturers winding down? Isn't it a government listening, saying, okay, well, we'll ensure that those jobs are kept in place till that point?
Oh, this is a Prime Minister listening to the votes of 39 of his own party room. That's the only listening that's going on here. And it was on the basis of that there was a knee-jerk response yesterday. And I was listening to the Industry Minister talk about how wonderful this decision was, the investment of this money in the car industry. It raises the very obvious question, if this is such a good idea, why did they make the decision to cut this money in the first place? And when they did that, the inevitable consequence was that the car industry would go offshore, and that's what's occurred.
We've only got a minute left, but I do want to get your reaction to this report in The Australian about the UN analysis of Australia's treatment of asylum seekers, saying that they took it on the basis of what activists had told them.
Well, this is again the government shooting the messenger, treating an important process with contempt. A one-page response was all this got from our government. It is important to take these processes seriously. People being in detention is a difficult issue.
Even if they're flawed?
Well, we've had real concerns about the prolonged detention of people, not just in Nauru and Manus, but also in Australia, the slow processing of people in PNG. Remember, the former minister, it took him months to even have a conversation with his counterpart in PNG around the question of resettlement, only after the tragic events which led to the death of Reza Barati. All of that, I think, affords more than a one-page response from our government in respect to a UN report. And it's not good enough to just shoot the messenger. If there's a great story here for the government to tell, you'd think they would have some pride in going out and telling it rather than covering it with a shroud of secrecy.
Mr. Marles, we're out of time. Thanks for your time this morning.